Okay, so Article 1187, it's complicated, but it can be summed up by three main parts. So this is the first part, this is the second part, and this is the third part. So let's start first with retroactivity. So what is retroactivity? It means that it goes back in time. So when, let's say, at this point in time, an agreement was constituted or an obligation was constituted. So let's say this is on June 30th, but the condition is that you graduate on January 1st. And if you graduate on January 1st, you'll get $1 million. So when you graduate on January 1st, in the books, it says that you were given $1 million in June 30th. So retroactivity is, in a way, reinventing the past, or either a good way to think about it is through the philosopher of Foucault. So he said that due to emergences in knowledge changes and power dynamics, we tend to see the past in a different light. So we reinterpret what happened in the past. And there are examples of this in history books. So, like, you learn something new, and then now your perspective on the past changes. So, that kind of comparison could help you remember what retroactivity really is. But in a way, it's just changing what happened in the past. Not really that, but then, yeah. So, the second part is in a conditional obligation to give, whether it's a reciprocal obligation, the fruits are mutually compensated, or in unilateral obligation, the fruits or interests are appropriated by the debtor. So, what does this mean? So, first, let's remember what a conditional obligation is. Of course, it needs a condition for it to happen. And in this case, there are two types. So, there's the reciprocal obligation and the unilateral obligation. So, reciprocal obligation is when both parties are debtors and creditors. Unilateral obligation is when there's only one debtor, when there's only one creditor. So when, let's say, there's a reciprocal obligation, let's say you hire a gardener, so and then the gardener has to do work for you, but you pay the gardener. So you are both partaking in this transaction. So let's say that the gardener did an extremely well done job, that he over exceeded expectations, is worth more the value. Let's say your expectations was that the garden will like an 8 out of 10, but then he made it out of a 10 out of 10. So what happens then? This extra thing we call fruits. We say that it is mutually compensated. So when you say mutually compensated, we assume that it's already part in there. So at its simplest case, we assume that the fruits, it was already part of the obligation. There will be no extra thing that you will have to give the gardener, because we mutually compensate for that. It's compensated already, meaning that it's already part of this. So will anything change? No. We'll assume that the extra extra improvements in the garden were part of the transaction in itself. So what about unilateral obligation? So if it's a unilateral obligation, let's say that the gardener offered to fix your garden for free and make it an 8 out of 10. But then the gardener made it out of a 10 out of 10. So those we call the extras, we call it fruits. So it will be appropriated to the debtor. What does this mean? So in the big picture, what it means is that the debtor will get to benefit from that because it's a unilateral obligation. So meaning, an example with the gardener example is that maybe he could use the extra improvements and add it to his profile, to his resume, and like take pictures and then like say that he did it or something like that. That's just an example from ChatGPT. It doesn't really make sense, but then you understand the main concept here is that the debtor is appropriated. The debtor benefits and can take advantage of the fruits and interests, given that it's a unilateral obligation. So we've done these two, and then now lastly is the conditional obligation to do or not to do. It just means that when it's a service or when you're not supposed to do something, the court determines. There's no condition here, whether it's a reciprocal, whether it's unilateral. That's about it. So yeah, that's the entire concept of Article 1187. To summarize it up, retroactivity means to reinterpret the past, or rather, assume that the thing happened on the Constitution when it was agreed. sorry, when it was agreed on the Constitution date. Secondly, conditional obligations to give. If it's reciprocal obligations, the fruits and interests are mutually compensated. But for unilateral obligations, they are appropriated to the debtor. And lastly, for conditional obligations to do or not to do, the court determines the effect. So yeah, I hope that helps.